Welcome back to episode 2 of Consultation Hour. I'm Jackie Moore, licensed clinical professional counselor, registered play therapist supervisor, and social media manager here at PESI. And I am so excited for you to hear this conversation that I got to have with Shawna Murray-Browne. Shawna Murray-Browne is an author, cultural historian, integrative psychotherapist, and liberation-focused healer. And our conversation is one that I think every clinician needs to hear right now. When we got the chance to talk, she shared 3 really tangible, actionable steps that every therapist in the world can take right now to make their practice feel more decolonized. She also shared strategies for how we can engage with our clients and with our communities and with our clients' communities in ways that will not only make us better clinicians, but make the world a better place as well. So I am so excited for you to hear this conversation. I know it was incredibly helpful for me. I learned so much talking with Shawna, and I'm sure you will learn just as much. Shawna, thank you so much for being here. We are really excited to have this conversation with you today. We have been, thinking about all of these ways that we can help therapists kind of work through the issues that they're seeing in their offices. And currently, a lot of the things that I'm hearing, and I'm sure you're hearing too, as part of this mental health community, is the importance of community and how can we as therapists kind of build this community, engage in our communities. And so when I started reading through your work, I was just like, this is it. We need to talk more about this and how we can, as therapists, cater our mental health treatment to populations that are underrepresented or marginalized, or voices aren't lifted up as much as others, and kind of build that community from the ground up and kind of strengthen those communities. So I really appreciate you being here and being willing to share those insights with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I thought that one of the best places for us to start was maybe by just kind of defining our terms a little bit. So I think when we hear the word decolonization, it's becoming more common to hear that language. And I think sometimes when that happens, we lose a little bit of the heart and the meaning of the message. So can you start by just telling us, what do we mean when we say decolonization of mental health?
Absolutely. That's a great question. You are so right. Things start to get super watered down after it only takes just a few a few posts and hashtags for things to get watered down. So decolonization literally means the repatriation of land and life, which is the return of land and life. And another way that the phrase, that the term is used is to decenter Eurocentric ways of thinking, being, doing, and connecting, and recentering Indigenous and African ways of doing things. And so when we're talking about what it means to decolonize mental health, obviously, or maybe it's not so obvious when we're talking about decolonization itself, we first begin with the land because of the historical implications of colonization and imperialism. The experience and our understanding of mental health care has been formed from this history of pillaging, of harming, of killing, and killing off not just people, but ways of knowing and thinking. So when we're thinking about decolonization and mental health care, one of the easiest ways to begin is to say, what does it mean for us to consider the history of our mental health care system, recognizing that we live in a colonized society and reality? What does it mean to recenter Indigenous ways of knowing and being around wellness, around connection, around what healing looks like? And then how can we support those populations that have been made marginal, beginning first with the original peoples of a given land where you live, and also extending to folks like my ancestry, where I'm not on my original land, but was forcibly brought here. What does it mean to create a space for those that we're serving to be able to reclaim their original ways of being and knowing?
Yeah, that's such a powerful way to encapsulate such a nuanced, layered, multifaceted sort of idea and concept. And I think what you described really gets to that heart of how intentionally dismantled these communities were. And so your approach really is to kind of reinforce those communities. And we'll talk about that more later. But I'm curious too. I know, you've talked a lot in the past about how when we can cater our mental health treatment to these, most marginalized members of our society, it improves outcomes for everyone. So how do you see that playing out in mental health treatment today?
Yeah, I think that I would be dishonest if I were to say that decolonization, the process, the collective activity of everyone deciding that they're going to remove themselves from unceded territory and shift the way that they're thinking, that it will feel good. Depending on where you are located in the sort of scheme of the world, of privileges, of colonization and your lineage, it will at first, or maybe for at first is a really quick way of saying maybe for a particular generation, will feel like something is being snatched away from you, right? But the truth is that what decolonization seeks to force people to recognize is that there are entire bodies of people, their bodies that have been dehumanized. And so it is of the benefit for everyone to ground ourselves in a perspective around human rights, right? It will be uncomfortable for us to sit with the history of where we come from and how we got here. But at the end, if we can imagine an ending of perhaps like the ways we see the world as it is, and imagine a new way forward. I believe that would mean a world where everyone's humanity is honored, a world where the land and all living things are acknowledged as valuable, as opposed to existing in a world where we're focused primarily on the acquisition of items and money and power. So I would say it would honor everybody's humanity. We would be living in right relationship with not only our fellow man, but also the land.
Yeah. So when you're describing that, my first thought is, I'm trying to contextualize this too for therapists who are like, well, how can I start? Where do I even start doing this work? Right. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like a lot of what you're describing is stories and listening. We need to go back to the fact that those stories and that history was intentionally erased and kind of part of the process to get people to kind of forget and create this new value system. And so that first step seems to be really just listening and learning the history. And I love that you pointed out that it's a generational thing, which I think for a lot of us therapists right now is really, really tough because it's like, we want change. We want to see it happen now. We want to help the world, but it's like, we're in it for the long haul. So I'm trying to think about like, what are those first steps we can take as therapists to feel like we're on this right track and moving forward?
I got you. It's a great question, and it is a question that I think is important to recognize that I'm sharing my perspective. There are many different perspectives, but I would say in alignment with your reflection around this being an invitation to listen, I would actually say that the first step is not listening outward, but listening inward, right? If I had to break down the three first steps and the first steps that, must be taken in order to further concretize what it means to decolonize your therapy practice would be to do the work of locating yourself, educating yourself, and then communing with your community and the land. So if we're talking about locating yourself, you might be like, what do you mean? Like I'm in Baltimore, Maryland, right? Unceded Piscataway, Conoy land. That's one way that you could locate yourself in the way that I'm describing. But really what I'm talking about is looking at who you are and your lineage, right? Not everyone that is of European descent has a lineage that physically enslaved African people. Not everyone has a lineage that contributed to the pillaging of indigenous peoples of this land and others. However, most Europeans, at least here in the United States, which was formerly called Turtle Island, benefit from this identity of this created identity of whiteness, right? And so really taking a look at your history, right? Your grandma, your grandma's grandma, your grandma's grandma's grandma, and really taking a look at, well, what is their history, right? What was their relationship? What were their perspectives? What kind of decisions did they make, right? Were they abolitionists? Were they immigrants and perhaps just came to the United States and now are benefiting from the concept and notion of white supremacy now? Right? When we're talking about folks of color that are therapists, right? What is the experience if you are an immigrant or your family migrated here some time ago? Still considering how has the history of imperialism, the global practice of harming whole peoples, how has that impacted your family? What is your relationship to this kind of takeover? So the locating yourself perspective is really beginning with what is my story? What is my relationship to the lineage with which I've inherited? And really being honest about how that is incongruent with who you are now or not, right? Does it feel correct? Are you receiving the torch from your ancestors and you're proud of it? And is that in alignment with the decolonial practice? Or are you ashamed, angry, scared to go ask those questions? And how do you actually feel about it? That process of locating yourself, it begins in a really deeply personal kind of space. I have found that for the folks in my network and community that I've had the honor of training, coaching, and guiding that are integrated, that are psychotherapists or integrative psychotherapists, sometimes it's helpful to hear other folks of similar ethnicities reflect and go through that heavy work. There are podcasts that offer space for white folks and folks of color, folks of mixed identity, ethnicity, and race that are disentangling these realities. Because it's helpful to know that you're not alone, that you're not feeling this thing all on your own. So that there are two other steps, but I want to stop there. But because I think that the locating self activity is the one that can be the most daunting, scary, and emotionally heart-wrenching.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that too. Of course, the first step is starting with that self-awareness. If we don't know ourselves, how can we come from this place of true empathy and compassion for others if we don't really do that deep work for ourselves first? And really interesting timing too for you to bring that up. I very, very recently, like this last month, have gone on a journey of kind of understanding my family's lineage. Wow. And I'm noticing as you're speaking about this, how much of my life I didn't even have to think about it. It wasn't even a question that came to my mind because, like you said, I benefited from these systems my whole life, never had to question where my family came from. But what I've learned has been so eye-opening, and it's been so amazing to see. My family history is my grandparents came from Ireland, and they were escaping persecution in Ireland. Mm-hmm. And I've been able to learn so much about that history that just was lost in the generations of storytelling. And it really has impacted my identity, which I never thought that it would. I was like, whatever, the family history doesn't really matter that much. But learning, and one of the things that I take into my practice as well, I work with kids. And so that intergenerational trauma piece is so huge to help people understand, these things that happened generations before are passed down not only in our genes and our body, but in the way that we parent and relate to people and have those relationships in our families. So learning more about that story really has been so eye-opening. So I really appreciate you sharing that also.
And thank you for sharing some of the things that come up, right? And the reality is that we have to have a level of compassion and allowance for ourselves over a period of time, because the truth is there are also therapists that I have held space for or trained, supervised even, that are like, listen, Dr. Shawna, I was adopted. I don't know. right? And the answer to that is still pretty relevant, right? Whoever has been caring for you, their lineage is informing who you are. And, I don't know if people want to swab and send something over to ancestry.com. This is not a commercial. But but information like that is similar to what folks like myself as an African American who would not otherwise be able to easily disentangle my European lineage and my African lineage easily. I had to go to things like African ancestry to get some clarity around, okay, what tribal lineage is the most prominent in my maternal line, right?
Mhm.
And so I add that to add to the complexity of what it can mean for many of us to begin that process, and that your experience, your listening to or contending with the stories of your ancestors, will bring a great deal of insight around your own culture, right? Your own customs, but also the pain and joy. And so, the other thing that I like to invite folks to consider is that it's okay to be angry with your ancestors. It's also okay to celebrate, to disentangle the positive aspects of what they have to offer, while also acknowledging the ways in which they weren't so awesome, right? And it's the same thing that we have to also do in the locating ourselves process when we think about what it means to be a therapist, because we have inherited this lineage of a way of offering care to folks that is powerfully impacted by where we are historically, where we are located, right? Ideals were stolen and perspectives of blanketed inferiority were placed on many of the folks that we're talking about centering, right? Folks that have been made marginal. Well, it was made, right? People of African descent and folks with indigenous lineage are not inherently marginal. They're not marginalized people. They were made marginal. And so we will come to find that much of the skill that we've learned as therapists, we really need it. But there's going to be some things that we consider throwing out or really struggling with or questioning. And so we're not throwing everything out, right? We're not completely damning our lineage, but we are being crystal clear and super honest about the work that we have as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that actually really leads in nicely to the next question I wanted to ask, also around kind of this concept of relationship. And I think when we do this work for ourselves and really get honest about our history and how we feel about it, it's easier for us to guide clients on that journey as well, who might be struggling with these same issues, and validating sort of their experience and helping them to see, the things that you're feeling are real. You are feeling these things because they exist in this society that we live in. And as you mentioned, you were made marginalized in this way. The society is created to make you feel this way. And, I live in Idaho, so very rural community, not a lot of great press for us typically, for good reason. And a lot of the work that I've done with clients is really having to validate that, like, yes, you're not making this up. This is happening because it exists in these systems that you're living in. So the question I have is around this concept of rapport versus relationship. And what does that mean? What's the distinction between just building rapport with your clients and really having a true relationship with your clients that helps them feel that validation?
Yeah, rapport has a purpose, right? When we're taught about rapport in our master's level education, right, we're taught to ask particular questions to invite folks to open up. We're also taught to share just a little about ourselves, to offer some connection, but it doesn't run deep. Rapport allows a space for seeing each other, but it is powerfully professional, right? It stays, in the inner part of what it means to connect. And it maintains oftentimes a very real power dynamic, right? Because it is often the therapist that is initiating rapport, and the therapist gets to decide if rapport was built, right? The therapist is based off of how the therapist feels, and a false notion of connection with the person that they're holding space for. Relationship, well, we know that that there's different layers of even how we use the word relationship. You got a deep one, an authentic one, or a fake one. But for the purposes of this conversation, I would qualify a genuine relationship being one that challenges the concept of who gets to decide that it's safe now, right? Because that's really what we're trying. That's the objective of rapport, is to create an experience or a feeling of safety for the client, and to position the therapist to be able to offer a semblance of care. Where in relationship building, the client is really guiding or leading in that. The client is invited to be able to ask the therapist questions that perhaps what you would need in the beginning to give permission for them to be able to do it, to model, hey, this is actually a relationship. I do intend to deeply hold space for you. And what questions do you have for me? I'll tell you a short story. When I was I'm located in Maryland. All of my degrees, all 3 of them, are from the University of Maryland. Go Terps. When I was an undergrad, I needed to go to a therapist on campus. I was referred by the Cultural Center, and I was really struggling. I went during I think it was like the Student of Color Hour, where we would be sure to be met with a psychologist that was a person of color, which I'm so glad existed then. I will not tell y'all when I graduated because that's none of y'all business. But, but that did exist then, right? However, it didn't help, because when I went in to see this other African-American psychologist who was likely old enough to be a parent, he opened the space by saying, okay, tell me about yourself. And I was like, okay, I'm talking, but I don't really tell my business. Right? Like I needed it to feel reciprocal. Yeah. Right. And so his objective was, let me get some information about you so I can tell you what you need to do. It's very much a professional, I'm the expert on you kind of style. Well, after he asked me like 3 or 4 questions, I was like, you're not going to talk, like, what's your favorite color? Where are you from? Like, I need to understand, who is this person that I am sharing all of this with? I'm not about to tell you all my business. And he refused. He refused to share. He said that was not my concern, that, I needed to let him do his job. And I left. I left. Now, while I do think that the current practice of many therapists across sectors, whether it be marriage and family therapy, social work, professional counseling, and psychology, I think that we know better now. I think that we're much better now, but that is a clear differentiation, right? Relationship is reciprocal. Mm-hmm. And you have to set some boundaries for that still in the context of decolonial therapy practice, but it should feel reciprocal to each person. They should know that you have stake in their well-being, and that the therapist that they see and the values that you talk about in your therapy, that if they were to see you outside, they don't have to worry about an article coming out about you calling the police on somebody that was birding in the park, right. Insert story about Karen, right? You shouldn't have to worry about an incongruence in the way you show up professionally and the values that you hold and the way that you show up when you're outside. And so that is what I would say is the difference between rapport, which has a particular objective of extracting and being attuned to what feels good for the provider, versus a relationship, which is reciprocal and equally sort of connected within reason around you being who you are genuinely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I appreciate you sharing that story as well. I think the pieces that stand out for me are really the power dynamic and acknowledging that we all have as therapists. When we're the ones writing the notes, we're the ones saying what happened during that session. And then there's this other piece of being aware of and acknowledging the way that these systems, and in particular the mental health system, has historically harmed people of color. Like being open to hearing that experience and acknowledging what your client needs from you to be able to trust you in this space. I think that that step in itself is so powerful for so many clients.
It is. And, everyone won't need that, right? There will be some folks that are like, listen, all I need is rapport. Okay, because I'm going to just come, you the doctor, I'm going to give you all the information, and then I'm going to leave. But it is important to have, to be clear about where you are positioning yourself in your expectation on how you provide your practice. And just for those that might be listening to this, I did go back. I went back 2 more times. I gave him a chance. Okay. I did. I gave it 2 more times, and he still would not budge on any of the information. Yeah. And that did make me feel uncomfortable. But say I was different. Say that my needs and my sort of cultural orientation was very much so all I was seeking was, okay, doc, this is what's going on. Okay, please help me, give me the tools. And that would be fine too. But it should be led by the client. And then you, the practitioner, gets to decide, is this something I'm willing to engage in?
Right. Yeah. And I'm thinking of an example. I mentioned before I work with kids, and for the last 7 years, I've had a private practice doing play therapy, working with kids, and having interns and training and things like that. And one thing that we see a lot in the practice with kids is custody issues and legal battles between parents and things like that. And so one thing that often comes up is especially as a mental health provider, looking at your policies and being able to have a little bit of flexibility with them to meet your clients where they're at. And, I can think of multiple examples where we had people of color walk into the door and say, I'm not giving you my custody agreement. Why do you need to see that? Like, that's none of your business. And instead of saying, well, we can't help you, being able to meet them where they're at and have a little bit of flexibility and saying, okay, I understand why you're saying that. We definitely need to do a lot more work to build trust and relationship if that is something that we need down the road.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that sort of lends itself to the second step that I would say, right? So we talked about locating oneself, and then we're talking about like educating yourself, right? Yeah. And, the thing that you opened with about the importance of listening and considering the history that is and the stories that the folks that you're serving might bring to the space and the table. The education work, you can't just go around asking just anybody, how should I do this, right?
Right.
And so sometimes the level of education is seeking out training that is decidedly decolonial. I've been training folks for, maybe like a decade, right? But most intentionally around decolonial work, at least since 2016, almost a decade. Okay. Shawna doing math. But, you want to have a kind of long range opportunity where you're learning, like, what is the history of the mental health care system in the United States of America, in the UK, and right, what is it? What are the implications for? Who was creating these rules? How were they treating Indigenous people, people of African descent? How are they treating other immigrants and other folks of color? What was considered the norm, the baseline of success, the research that was done? And I have me a PhD, and yes, I'm putting quotes up around research because much of the mental health care system was informed by very harmful medical racism, right? And ideals of inferiority. That's been embedded in our concepts and practices. And we are still every day tasked with the responsibility of disentangling it. And so going through a training that includes what is the history of the mental health care system and from whose perspective, right? I teach in a way that centers the African American experience. I know others that teach and center the indigenous sort of ways of knowing here in the United States, and others that might teach from a full bird's eye view. I think it's important to do both, right? To have perspectives that center particular lineages and particular kind of stories, because you get a better understanding of how this looks in modern day. I always tell all of my students, what is important to me is for you to cultivate the eyes to see the lineage of oppression in your everyday work. That when you look at a policy, you can see the line from now to 100 years ago, or even further, so that you can begin to think thoughtfully and strategically how you're going to keep your license, okay? Okay. How you're going to keep your license, and how you're going to honor the humanity of this individual person, this community, or this family and their lineage, right? Because that is really what you're inviting into the space. And so education can be a training, modules, live training. It could also be hiring a consultant, a supervisor, someone that you look up to, a coach that, not a coach that's not a therapist, y'all, just so we're clear. I don't think here, but a coach for you to cultivate what I consider a liberatory way of offering care. It requires an investment, a long-term investment of time, so that when you mess up, because I know we're going to get there, because everybody, it's like part of like being a human, like you're going to really mess up. You're going to do something wrong. And it's so much more helpful to have either a cadre of folks that you're in a learning journey with, or an advisor, a consultant, a mentor to support you in really doing the deep work with yourself around how can I do this better, or how can I plan for this? What are some of the things that I need to consider? It needs to be a place where you feel safe, and it needs to be with people that you at least trust enough to be your most authentic self.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just absorbing all of that. I feel like there was so much value. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know you mentioned that we will make mistakes. We will say things that we are, I think every therapist has had that experience where they go home and they're like, why did I say that? Like, how am I going to fix this? Or what am I going to do to repair next time? Yeah. And that vulnerability piece. And I love how you highlighted too the importance of safety. You have to have that relationship where you know that you can trust this person to go be honest about what you're feeling, thinking, and have the safety to explore that and be able to come up with what is my next step and how do I keep that relationship in the forefront of my mind.
I mean, and it's so important too, because if we think about it, I don't know if programs across the country have shifted this notion, but really and truly, therapists aren't expected to be human. We are expected to already know the thing, know how to show up. We should know better, right? And to be able to cite why we're doing the thing, right? It is a heavy weight. And so at least in the process of seeking to establish a safe space for learning and processing and strategizing, and trying on new ways of looking at the world, new worldviews, you have to be able to feel like in this space, I can be a whole human being, right? Because most of us don't become therapists for no reason. We have our own stories and motivations that must be unpacked as we are talking about, especially if you are a person of great privilege. And we're already at a certain level of privilege if we're therapists, right? but being able to contend with the multi-leveled privileges that we have, you need to know that you can fumble in the presence of this particular person and that they will support you in not eliciting more shame and more guilt, but providing you the tools so that you can navigate that journey on your own. Because there's not any relationship you or I could think of where we never made a mistake, right? Mm-hmm. Relationships are built and strengthened through an allowance of mistakes and learning how to repair.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to put this in my kid mental health language, because the way that it feels to me too is I talk a lot with parents about like windows of tolerance and how with our kids, we can kind of help them step a little bit outside their window, then come right back into that, regulation, and kind of having that safety of maybe the supervisory or consultation relationship to take some chances, step a little bit outside of your comfort zone, but come right back in and be able to integrate that learning that you have that might have been a little bit vulnerable or uncomfortable within the context of that relationship. And it's interesting too. I think it leads to my next question. You and I have talked a little bit in the past about the difference between big C community and little C community, and how we can engage as therapists in these two different versions of community. And I think that idea is so helpful for therapists. So can you explain a little bit more about what we mean when we say big C community or little C community?
Yeah, and I will, say too, this is a concept that I developed because I just got so frustrated in my conversations, especially I'm a social worker by training, especially in the social work field where social workers are trained to look at person and community and are trained to, we're trained to do both community grassroots work and advocacy, and can also cultivate the skill set to provide psychotherapy. I would get so frustrated in my work with nonprofits and behavioral health organizations at the jobs that I have previously had, where folks would say, yeah, well, when we talk to the community or what the community wants, and it's like, who is this community? I don't see them. Where are they at? Okay, do we have an advisory board? Are y'all out here canvassing? Like, what is it we're talking about? So big C community is that, right? The word we might use when we say we serve the community, but it's not well defined. The word that the sort of catch-all phrase when we're talking about the Black community, the white community, right? It's a catch-all phrase to put everybody of a particular identity in a space. The Baltimore community, the Idaho community. What does that even mean? Okay. Who are the spokespeople, right? Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, therapists are not challenged to, one, assess their own little C community, which is if someone leaves, you miss it. You can feel it. Mm. Little C community, and I would say what's smaller than that is village, and what's smaller than that is family. So we got village, we got family, village, little C community, big C community, okay? Mm-hmm. And little C community, which I think, unfortunately, in some circumstances, folks are losing the ability or the skill set, the tolerance to commune and connect in this way due to so many things, but social media sometimes helps and sometimes hinders. Little C community might mean a person in your neighborhood, for example. So I've lived in two different kinds of neighborhoods. I've lived in an apartment complex, and today I live in a single family home. The difference here wasn't about the size of the home or whether or not I owned it or whatever. But in my apartment complex, I only knew my leasing agent. Maybe I knew the next door neighbor because her baby was crying so much. Maybe I heard I saw the elder neighbor walk down the steps. But if I don't see them, I'm not missing anything. If there was a huge problem in that neighborhood, I would not know that there's a person locally to be able to resolve it. If I saw a child outside, I might not know where they live. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the neighborhood that I live in now, I have a really strong community association. If I walk down the street, I'm a regular. I'm taking a walk with my family regularly. If we don't do the walk and then we go back to walking, the neighbor's house that I pass, they will remember, where you been? I ain't seen you, right? Do folks in my locale know that I'm a therapist? They might not know I'm my business. They won't because they're not in my village, right? But they should know that I exist. They will know when I'm missing. So the work for a therapist, one is to acknowledge that we have many different little C communities. I named one in my present neighborhood, but all neighborhoods aren't little C communities, as I just described. But another little C community that I have is the cultural community here in the city of Baltimore. I live in a predominantly African American, or albeit Black city. And in the city, there's a cultural community that is the community that is preserving African American, African, and just Black history and culture and teaches it as African dance. I see it when I'm going to Black History Month events. I have elders in the community. Mama Cheryl and Mama Brenda are going to come over and say, hey, girl, you're looking good since you finished that degree. Okay. All right. Am I going to see you over? Right. They missed me. Okay. No, they don't know that I was out of town last week, but they actually know me. And so for a therapist, and when, I started Kindred Wellness first as an integrative psychotherapy practice where I was serving primarily African-American women and their daughters. These African-American women were women in leadership and change makers, activists, and advocates in the city of Baltimore. And so this does make it complex, y'all, because I'm very connected in my city, right? I am also an activist in my city. So it did complicate things. But the truth is, in my private practice, I will have a person in the community that will call me and say, my cousin needs a therapist, Shawna. And I would be like, listen, I can't be a cousin's therapist. Okay, I can't. But I'm going to refer you to somebody that I know, right? And so like a little C community is where folks know that they can call on you and there is a reciprocity there, right? Mm-hmm. Big C community, it might mean a certain locale, but they don't miss you when you're gone. Mm-hmm. They don't miss.
Yeah, that is such a powerful way of stating it too, that people notice when you're gone. And I think you alluded to this before, but in some ways, I think we're doing better about cultivating that. In some ways, we're doing not so great in cultivating that. I think you mentioned social media, but we can feel like we're connected when we're actually very disparate, which is a challenge.
It's really a struggle. It is. I will tell you, maybe it was, I don't know what year. I really have a hard time remembering years ever since the pandemic, but I will say, there was a time where the only people that followed me on my Instagram were the people that actually knew me in the city of Baltimore, right? Mm-hmm. I used it to communicate with folks in my little C community. When my training, Decolonizing Therapy for Black Folk, went viral, it expanded my reach, which was great, but it also distorted this concept and notion of connection for me. Like, I was not used to folks outside of Baltimore knowing my name. Like, what? Oh, you saw me where? Who? What? You feel like you know me? You want to give me a hug? What is going on? And so the concept of establishing little C community for a therapist can be quite complex, given the fact that we are socialized and trained to ensure that we're not mixing personal and professional, but in a rural community or in a small town, so much of what I'm describing often is inevitable, right? Yeah. And I am suggesting that inevitable, why complex, ensures that when systems that we have relied on, wink, wink, for years and years and years are at risk of being interrupted, we have enough relationship to be able to, and trust and acknowledgement to be able to still ensure that the people in our locale are getting their needs met. So a first step for a therapist that's like, I don't know about the little C community thing. Like, what would be my first step? And I would say I would invite folks to get their toe in the water by starting with your neighborhood association, right? Like, start with your neighbors. Like,
Yeah.
just like literally, yeah, it might be awkward. Find a reason. I don't know. I know is it Minneapolis? There's about to be some snow. Next time when you shovel your snow, okay, you're gonna shovel your snow. Go shovel your neighbor's snow and knock on the door and ask them if it's all right. Right? Go and do something to establish a semblance of connection and rapport from a genuine space.
Mhm.
You following somebody on Instagram, but you won't say hi to them.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
weird.
It's weird.
Yeah, it's weird. Or even for our friends, right? I unfollowed one of my closest friends the other day and he didn't notice. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And that's fine. I wasn't bothered by it because I wasn't doing it to be malicious. I
Right.
unfollowed him because I was like, I've known you since middle school. Okay. And we are not in our 20s. Okay. And I don't want to see your highlight reel. I want to know your real life. So
Right.
I unfollowed you because I don't want to see that. I'm gonna text you and let's go to dinner, right? Like I've had to make certain decisions around how I engage. And so
Yeah.
other consideration for a therapist, once you've assessed your actual like network, that's easy opportunity to connect. Go shovel somebody's snow, go rake their leaves, right? Or text a friend and say, I haven't seen you in a while. It's then you can start to explore, hopefully with some kind of supervisor, advisor, guidance, right? Especially if you're engaging a community that has been made marginal and you are of a privileged background. If you are a white person and you're like, I want to better serve Black folk. Well, do the Black folk want you to better serve them? That's a consideration. What lets you know that your services are needed? And if they're needed, then you can do an assessment. Where are the grassroots-led initiatives in my city, in my neighborhood, in my county? Right? Who are the leaders? What events are they having? How can I offer support to just introduce myself? To say, hey, I see that you're doing this great work. These are some of the ways that I can offer support. I know you don't know me. Would love to take you out to coffee, just, to get some clarity around what you're doing and how I can offer connection if you're interested. Right? Or you could just show up to some cultural events, arts events, like community events, and be consistent, right? Is there a neighborhood garden? Go there and show up with a shovel, talk to the people that you're sitting next to, but always begin first with locating oneself. What is the nature of you? Of your connection, your communion. So that's the last thing that I would say is important for folks to chew on, right? So we have locate yourself, educate and establish a cadre of safety for, journeying in and making mistakes, a place where you can be fully vulnerable in both your professional identity and you as a human being, and then commune. Get your pinky toe out in your local neighborhood. And once you've contended with the education that you have and you start to begin to embody it, then you can expand beyond that. But doing it any other way, and granted, this work will continue. You will continue all three steps all throughout, and you will get better and better. Communing first with your own people will make it a lot less awkward, because we don't want you going out saying, oh, let me help your organization.
Right.
You didn't ask. You were coming over here because you're trying to get some more clients for your therapy. Like, that is not relationship. That's for war,
Yeah, definitely. Oh, so much to unpack there. I feel like my head is just swimming, but there were so many pieces that you pointed out that I'm just, like, yes, that is immediately tangible. And one of the points you made, you had said something about how in, rural communities that in overlap is inevitable. And you're absolutely right. You're going to see your clients out in the community.
Yes.
Become part of their different communities. So why not make that a little bit more intentional? And to your earlier point, about how we as therapists are trained to be these like blank slates, empty shells of humans.
Yeah.
How can we get ahead of that and talk with our clients about, hey, what if I see you in the community? How do you want me to interact with you? And do you want me to acknowledge you, or do you want to acknowledge me, and kind of get ahead of those conversations? But so many amazing points. And I think it all does come back to that first point that you made around centering yourself and understanding what your intentions are and where you're coming from and what's fueling that. And kind of taking the next step from there is so powerful.
We've got to start. I mean, I know that there are some therapy training educational programs that maybe it's psychology where you have to be in therapy in order, like that's a part of your education.
Yeah.
That was not a part of my education. As a social worker, I don't know. I wish it should be a part of a normal sort of a way of connecting, right? A way of normalizing this human interaction, of supporting someone and transforming their lives, offering care. One of the questions I used to really struggle with early in my career in the establishment of my private practice, and this sort of teeters on the ethical dynamics in when you're engaging community, is, I went to my supervisor, mentor at the time. She wasn't really my mentor, she was my mentor. But I was paying her for clinical supervision. And she's still my mentor today, even though I don't pay her for supervision. I just sit at her house and drink some tea and listen to everything she has to say. But I was concerned because I was like, oh no, is it okay for me to love my clients? Like, is that allowed? It's like, no, I don't want to tell them that I love them. That's not what I mean. Like, what is this thing I'm feeling where I really am impacted by what's happening with this client. I don't want to take it at home. No, I'm not trying to, be at the client's wedding or anything like that. But I am feeling something more deeply than very transactional give and take and leave. And this is more likely if you have little C community, or if you actually live in a rural environment or a small town environment, and you've known this particular client. Maybe they went to the same church as you. Maybe their child go to the same school as yours, and you know things about them that have you deeply care. And what my mentor, clinical supervisor said to me, she was like, of course. She said, what kind of therapist would you be if you were offering care the way that the Gap sells you pants? If you didn't actually love them, what you should be expressing is, in your care that they should feel like that they're loved. That is a natural part of human connection, right? And I needed to destigmatize that for myself. Not and I want to be clear, this is not something that I felt I needed to profess.
Right.
Right. I'm talking about, right. I'm providing therapy to a teenager, and some amazing thing happens for her, or something life-changing, horrible, gut-wrenching happens, and the mom is coming to me for support and advisement, and I'm finishing that therapy session. They have paid for their session, and I close the door, and why am I crying? Oh, that's love. Like I can't, and so we also have to sort of acknowledge the very human work of being a therapist when you're doing it from a decolonial perspective. If you genuinely care, have a place to put it. Okay. Do not call your client talking about, I love you. That is a no. Okay. Immediately no. Go to your supervisor, go to your, play and process through to prevent transference, countertransference. Absolutely. But the human part of exchanging care, compassion, and support, if it's not coming from your heart, where is it coming from?
Yeah. And we talk a lot at PESI about kind of what is this next evolution in the field of therapy. And I think you are speaking directly to the heart of what that is, which is, it's all related. This decolonizing mental health means that you're not just treating your clients who have been made marginalized differently or in a different way or with more compassion or understanding, it's extending to all of the clients that you work with.
Yeah.
You are treating your clients from this place of deep care, respect, love, relationship. And part of that evolution for us as therapists too, I think this newer generation of therapists is moving towards that. Well, is it okay for me to express that to my clients? And how can I do that in an ethical way? Like you said,
I don't.
Being aware. Yeah.
I don't think we're ready to, I don't know if I'm going to be alive when we get ready to, and I don't know that it is necessary to say
right.
that, but it should be felt, you know?
Yeah.
Folks, one of the things that is important to bring into this conversation, especially when we're talking about serving populations made marginal, and in this specific conversation, I'm going to talk about the African American community. You know, there was a point where in my private practice, where I was seeing folks fee for service. I was not accepting insurance. And this is important because the exchange of money also just inevitably changes the dynamic. It's still a business, even though I care for you. This is an exchange of energy, right? Mm-hmm. But I was also providing another arm of my private practice was my grassroots healing initiatives, right? I had three. One was Healing Be More Activists. One was the Heal a Sister Project, and the other was Sister Soul Quest. Sister Soul Quest were for children, little girls and their caregivers. It was provided in the schools. Healing Be More Activists was for activists. And the Heal a Sister Project were primarily for Black, Indigenous, and folks of color women, and were turning to how to heal themselves. Well, the reality is that, you know, when I was offering that kind of care and community, if I was off on a particular day or having a bad day and I'm in the school and I'm facilitating a healing circle for these children, and they can feel that I'm grumpy. Mm-hmm. If I'm ruffled, and you know, just the same way that you can love some clients, there's some clients you're not going to like, right? And you have to find the love, because I actually teach my 7-year-old daughter this. You know, you can love someone that you don't like. Okay, so there's some children in there. Maybe they're doing some things, and I need to get supervision about this later because it's making me frustrated. But if ever I came into that school and I was holding space for the children, and especially in the beginning, the first 2 or 3 healing circles, mindfulness circles, spaces, if the children couldn't feel that I loved them, I want you to know that it didn't work. Okay. It took me longer, right? Until I could get to the loving energy. So, mm-hmm. I know that this is not what you were saying. I know you're not suggesting that we get to maybe telling people that, but right. I am saying for those that are listening, right? Like, especially when you're working with populations that have been made marginal, the crux of the cultural understanding of what care actually means, at least for the African American community, and what I found to remain true on the continent of Africa and in my work in Costa Rica with Afro-Costa Rica women and across populations of folks made marginal, is that we acknowledge both the tangible, the seen, and the unseen, right? And so, you know, if your heart isn't in the right place, if you are energetically if your intentions are not pure, you will not be effective, period, mm-hmm. right? And, you know, when we talked about decolonization, there's another phrase or word that, you know, a therapist might not walk around and have in their lexicon, but that I'll introduce, and that is called epistemicide. Mm. Epistemicide is the destruction of ways of knowing. It is the destruction of ways of knowing. And so when we engage as therapists oftentimes in navigating in the current society that centers European ways of knowing, white value systems of write everything down, it needs to be counted. How do we know it's true? What are the facts? And even the weird notions of science that, if we can't see it, it ain't true, as if we're not breathing oxygen right now. You have to, one of the other things to contend with is the value system, the worldview of folks that still acknowledge a more indigenous and original ways of connecting, is that even the things that we can't see, what some folks might consider to be purely spirituality or religion, right? It can expand much, even wider for cultural community. Mm-hmm. And so another acknowledgement of that is, if I feel like it's not right, it's not right. You know? And so if I go to a therapist and I feel like it's not right, I'm going to make decisions off of that. I'm saying this as an invitation for folks to expand their minds around what is true and what is considered, right? And to acknowledge even that in yourself.
Yeah. And it sounds like what you're describing too is this quality of attunement. It all comes back to those basic counseling skills of, I work with kids. If I'm not attuned, they're going to call me out quickly.
They can feel it.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Whatever you want to call it, okay.
And then add layers of trauma and generational trauma and maybe neurodivergence on top of that. And they are picking up on everything. And so to your point, if you're not coming from that genuine space, but I love how you contextualized it as well in terms of you can have this genuine love for your client, but it might not be the most loving therapeutic choice to tell them that straight to their face, right? No. We still need to have boundaries and have that awareness of that countertransference and making sure we're making the most ethical therapeutic choice, but that our clients will feel that.
Yes, they know. Mm-hmm. I actually have had multiple clients say to me at one point, because I would, I'm just loving them from the chair. They're supporting them throughout their treatment, right? Throughout their experience. And I remember one particular client stopped, working with her, closed my private practice, went to school, came back to doing some of the work, saw her at a community event. And she said, "Hey, Dr. Shawna." And she telling everybody that I was a therapist. Okay, she's telling everybody. I'm just looking like, smiling like,
a nightmare.
Okay, girl, all right. And she's like, she was like, I knew you loved me. I knew you did. And it's just like, come on, give me a hug. It's cool. You know what I mean? And so there are times your client, they can feel it. You know what I mean? It is inevitable. And so you just, you want to be in right relationship there.
Yeah. Yeah. That congruence. I think people can feel that. Whether they're trained as therapists or not, we can feel when people are being authentic and genuine with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was, I feel like I've learned so much from you just in this last, almost an hour that we've been talking. And I'm really excited for our audience to hear a little bit more about if they want to hear more from you. You're going to be speaking at Symposium in a couple of weeks.
I am.
Yeah. So all about demystifying, decolonized practice demystified is the name.
Yeah.
So do you mind telling us a little bit about what that is, what we can look forward to at Symposium in a couple of weeks?
Absolutely. So in previous years at Symposium, I have talked about how to heal a sister, specifically for Black women. What does it mean to sort of morph therapy to meet their needs? The last 2 years, I've been talking about what it means to decolonize mental health and the healing power of Black community. And so this year, I'm demystifying decolonial practice and centering specifically on how I'm doing that in the now, and reflecting back on some of the methods that I have used in my practice that I described here. So we'll be talking about, what decolonial practice is, what it isn't. And then we'll talk about healing circles and the use of oral histories, the way that I have used an oral history archive to initiate a healing space for local Black women in the city. I'll offer some insight around the difference between a healing circle and a therapy group. The difference between psychotherapy, psychoeducational therapeutic spaces and healing spaces in a community, and some of the sort of ethical considerations that we need to put in place in order to ensure that we're offering care and not harm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is such a great opportunity for people, like we were talking about earlier, that second step of making sure that you are educating yourself and taking these opportunities to learn from people who are doing this work and doing it so beautifully. So again, I'm so grateful for the time that you were able to spend with us today. I've learned so much. I know everyone else will learn so much from you, and I'm very much looking forward to meeting you in person in a couple of weeks.
Yes, it's going to be great.
Yeah, I'm so excited.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I love it.
Thank you. Yeah.